In the shadows of Renaissance Italy, where sacred hymns echoed through the cathedrals by day and whispered sins filled their halls by night, the life of a young girl unfolded like a dark opera. Her name was Lucrezia Borgia, and even 500 years later, it still sends a chill down the spine. Born into a world where her own father would rise to become the Pope, Lucrezia wasn't raised in holiness. She was raised in ambition, used not as a child to be loved, but as a pawn to be moved across the blood-stained chessboard of papal power. What happens when the man who claims to be God's voice on earth turns his daughter into a tool for lust, leverage, and legacy? The answer is one of the most haunting stories of corruption, control, and stolen innocence in history. The year was 1480. Lucrezia entered the world in Rome, not just into any family, but into the infamous Borgia dynasty, a family name now synonymous with poison, scandal, and political manipulation. Her father, Rodrigo Borgia, wasn't yet Pope when she was born, but he was already deeply entrenched in the corrupt inner workings of the Catholic Church, using it not as a path to salvation, but as a ladder to absolute power. Despite the Renaissance being celebrated for its art, literature, and intellectual rebirth, it was also a time when morality was for sale, and power was the only truth that mattered. Especially within the Papal States, where sacred vows and unholy actions lived side by side. Cardinals kept mistresses, bribed their way into higher offices, and plotted assassinations just as casually as they planned sermons. And the Borgias? They didn't just join in. They elevated sin into strategy. Lucrezia was born out of wedlock. Her mother, Vanozza de Catane, was Rodrigo's longtime mistress, in an era when illegitimate children were usually hidden or forgotten. Lucrezia was different. From her earliest days, she was being prepared, polished, trained, and positioned, not for love or learning, but to be a living treaty, a human alliance, a stunningly beautiful bargaining chip. The Rome she grew up in was a dangerous place. Assassins were as common as altar boys. Poison was as frequent as prayer. Even the Vatican, supposedly the holiest place on earth, had become a playground for perversion. The stories weren't whispers. They were well-documented accounts. One of the most infamous came from Johann Burchard, the papal master of ceremonies, who described a dinner in the papal palace known as the Banquet of the Chestnuts. 50 courtesans, completely nude, crawled on all fours to gather chestnuts from the floor, while the Pope, his son, and other nobles watched and awarded prizes for sexual performance. This wasn't fiction. This was Lucrezia's reality. While other children learned to read or recite prayers, Lucrezia was learning how to survive among predators. By the time she was 11, she'd already been engaged twice. First to a Spanish noble when she was just 10 years old, and then again when political alliances shifted. These weren't love stories, they were contracts. Her name, her body, her future, all used as currency by her father to buy influence and security. And then came the event that would seal Lucrezia's fate. In 1492, her father officially bought his way into the papacy. Through a campaign of bribery so flagrant that even other corrupt officials were appalled, Rodrigo Borgia became Pope Alexander VI. He secured votes in the papal conclave with promises of money, lands, and power. The moment he put on the papal tiara, he didn't become more holy. He became more dangerous. As Pope, Alexander VI wasted no time using the church as a personal empire. His lusts, both political and carnal, were insatiable. And Lucrezia? At just 12 years old, she became a key piece of his strategy. Her first marriage, to Giovanni Sforza, was arranged when she was barely 13, The ceremony was held in the Vatican itself, more of a power merger than a wedding. Contemporary descriptions say Lucrezia was breathtakingly beautiful, golden hair, graceful demeanor, and already displaying a sharp intelligence behind her delicate exterior. But in the Borgia family, beauty wasn't a blessing. It was a weapon. And Lucrezia was being taught to wield it, whether she wanted to or not. Behind closed doors, things grew even darker. It's said that Pope Alexander VI demanded detailed reports on Lucrezia's wedding night. Some even claimed he insisted on being present for the consummation. While these accounts remain disputed, the idea that her own father might have interfered so grotesquely speaks to the twisted control he exercised over her. When the political alliance with the Sforzas fell apart, the Pope sought to annul the marriage. Giovanni Sforza didn't go quietly. He accused the Borgias of incest, publicly claiming that they wanted him out of the way so the Pope and his daughter could continue their relationship without interference. Whether these claims were true or vengeful exaggerations, they stuck. Because in the atmosphere of Renaissance Rome, where the Borgia family's actual crimes were already unbelievable, even the most scandalous rumors sounded plausible. To dissolve the marriage, Pope Alexander declared it had never been consummated, even though Lucrezia had lived with Giovanni for years. To prove this, Lucrezia was forced to undergo a humiliating public examination by midwives who were tasked with confirming her virginity. Imagine being a young woman whose most intimate experience, or lack thereof, had to be examined and announced for political convenience. It was yet another layer of psychological torment. But the betrayal didn't stop with her father. Her brother, Cesare Borgia, was perhaps even more terrifying. While the Pope chased power and pleasure, Cesare seemed driven by something colder, a calculating ambition mixed with a rumored, possibly obsessive fixation on his sister. Cesare was handsome, brilliant, and utterly ruthless, the perfect enforcer for Borgia ambitions. Lucrezia found herself caught between two powerful men who were supposed to love her, yet used and controlled her at every turn. Then came her second marriage, this time to Alfonso of Aragon. For a brief moment, it seemed Lucrezia might have found peace. She was 17, and by all accounts, genuinely cared for Alfonso. She bore him a son, Rodrigo, and lived in what some described as a rare window of happiness. But the Borgias couldn't tolerate anyone else holding Lucrezia's heart. In 1500, Alfonso was attacked on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica. He survived barely, and Lucrezia personally cared for him as he recovered, even preparing his meals to prevent poisoning. But it wasn't enough. Cesare reportedly said, "What was not done at lunch will be done at dinner." He and his men stormed Alfonso's chambers. Lucrezia and her sister-in-law were dragged out, and Alfonso was strangled in his bed. The official cause of death? Fever. But everyone knew the truth. Lucrezia's grief was immediate and real. Witnesses described her as shattered, her eyes vacant, her spirit hollow. That moment marked the death of whatever innocence remained. The tears she wept over Alfonso were the last public sign of vulnerability she would show for years. After Alfonso's murder, the whispers around Lucrezia turned into roars. The rumors took on a life of their own. Servants spoke of her being summoned to the papal apartments in the dead of night. They whispered about Cesare's jealous outbursts whenever another man so much as looked at her. And then came the most disturbing mystery of all: the appearance of an infant, listed in Vatican records as Infans Romanus. No one could quite explain where this child came from. Two contradictory papal bulls were issued, one claiming the child was Cesare's, another suggesting he was the Pope's. Both documents were conspicuously silent on who the mother might be. The implications were sinister, and Lucrezia's name was once again entangled in scandal. Was she the mother? Was the child the product of incest? No one could say for sure. But in the cesspool of Borgia Rome, the lines between truth, rumor, and propaganda were too blurred to tell. And yet, despite all of this, or maybe because of it, Lucrezia survived. By her early 20s, she was no longer the naive girl used by her family, but a woman who had learned how to play the game herself. She understood now that she would never be free of her family name, but perhaps she could forge a new identity within its shadow. Her third marriage was her most consequential, not because of scandal, but because of what it represented. Lucrezia was offered to Alfonso d'Este, heir to the Duchy of Ferrara, one of the most prestigious courts in northern Italy. It was a difficult match to arrange. The Este family, despite their own share of secrets, recoiled at the idea of marrying into the Borgia clan. Lucrezia's reputation had already reached Ferrara long before she did. Stories of poison rings, incest, and betrayal had stained her name. But politics prevailed. And this time, Lucrezia wasn't just handed over like before. She negotiated. She insisted on a substantial dowry, the guarantee of a noble title, and security in her position. It was a shrewd, almost transactional set of demands, not the actions of a helpless pawn, but of a woman who had spent her life being used and had finally decided to gain something in return. When she arrived in Ferrara in 1502, she found, for the first time in her life, a degree of distance from her family's immediate control. Her father remained in Rome, still manipulating from afar. Cesare was carving out a violent principality in central Italy. And Lucrezia? She began to build a life of her own. In Ferrara, something unexpected happened. She flourished. Away from the Vatican's suffocating grip, Lucrezia emerged not as a seductress or villain, but as a capable duchess and a refined patron of the arts. She surrounded herself with poets, scholars, painters, and thinkers. She hosted salons, commissioned works of music and literature, and turned Ferrara's court into a vibrant cultural hub. She ruled in her husband's absence with poise and skill, managing affairs of state in a way that impressed even her critics. Lucrezia had always been intelligent, that much is clear. But now she had the space to show it. Her correspondence with leading humanists, including the celebrated Pietro Bembo, revealed a woman of intellectual depth and emotional complexity. The letters between them, filled with poetry, philosophy, and flirtation, have become famous, not for scandal, but for their beauty. Bembo, who had access to some of the greatest minds of his generation, clearly considered Lucrezia his equal. But even as she built this new life, the past continued to weigh on her. Her pregnancies, and there were many, were difficult and often tragic. Lucrezia was pregnant at least 11 times. Many of those pregnancies ended in miscarriage or stillbirth. The physical toll was immense. The psychological cost even greater. Each child lost was a reminder of how her body had been used, first by her father, then by politics, and now by dynastic duty. Even motherhood, the one role that brought her a sense of peace, was haunted by pain. The children who did survive became her lifeline. She loved them fiercely, protectively, perhaps obsessively. She saw in them the chance to create a life untainted by the Borgia legacy. But one can imagine her fear. Fear that the cruelty, the ambition, the darkness that had haunted her bloodline might rise again in another generation. That her children might become the very monsters she had escaped. Meanwhile, in Rome, the world that had tormented her began to collapse. Pope Alexander VI, her father, died suddenly in 1503. Officially, the cause was fever. Unofficially, many whispered he'd been poisoned, possibly by accident, after a botched dinner intended to poison someone else. When Lucrezia received news of his death, there were no tears, no visible grief, only quiet, calm calculation. She immediately moved to secure her position in Ferrara, making sure the fall of her father didn't drag her back into chaos. It was, in many ways, the most telling reaction of all. The man who had given her life had taken so much more from it. And when he was gone, all she felt was relief. Cesare's downfall followed closely behind. Without the Pope to shield him, he became vulnerable. His enemies closed in. The feared enforcer of the Borgia family, who had murdered, tortured, and ruled with brutality, was eventually captured, imprisoned, escaped, and was killed during a minor skirmish in Spain. Lucrezia's response to his death was quieter than expected. She wore mourning clothes far longer than etiquette required. Some say it was genuine grief. Others say it was political theater. Perhaps it was both. Cesare had been her brother, her tormentor, her protector, and possibly more. Their bond was complicated, and no one, not even Lucrezia, could fully explain it. But one thing was clear. With her father and brother gone, Lucrezia was finally free to live on her own terms. And in Ferrara, she continued to do just that. She ruled with intelligence, won the respect of her husband and his court, and earned a new reputation, not as the Borgia temptress, but as the cultured, competent Duchess of Ferrara. For the first time, she was not being used. She was simply being. But history never forgets. No matter how she tried to distance herself from the scandals of her youth, the legends lingered. The stories of incest, of poison, of manipulation. They followed her, twisted and embellished by time. And Lucrezia? She said little. Her letters rarely spoke of the past. Her silence may have been her final defense, the one thing she could still control. By the time Lucrezia entered her final decade of life, she had reshaped her identity, not just for the world, but for herself. In Ferrara, she wasn't Lucrezia Borgia, the seductress of Rome, the pawn of popes, the whispered villain of Renaissance gossip. She was La Duchessa, a political partner to her husband, a patron of the arts, a mother, and a survivor. Her court in Ferrara became a beacon of refinement and culture. Artists, poets, musicians, philosophers, all found support and inspiration under her roof. Her name began to appear in correspondence alongside the most respected intellectuals of her day, and not as a curiosity, but as a peer. The French king reportedly referred to her as the most intelligent and illustrious lady in all of Italy. Slowly, her reputation began to shift. Not completely, not cleanly, but noticeably. Still, despite this public transformation, the past never stopped leaving its mark. Lucrezia's health had been deteriorating. Years of difficult pregnancies had worn her down. Each childbirth brought more complications, more danger. And emotionally, the losses added up. She had outlived her parents, her brother, her first two husbands, and several of her own children. She carried these scars quietly, with a grace that some mistook for coldness. But the weight was real, and it was growing heavier. In 1519, at the age of 39, she became pregnant again. It would be her 11th known pregnancy. This time, the risks proved too great. The child, a daughter, survived only briefly. Lucrezia herself developed a fever, likely puerperal sepsis, a common and deadly infection related to childbirth in that era. Despite medical attention, her condition worsened. Her final days were described by those who witnessed them as peaceful, even serene. She faced death with a calm that startled many, not with fear, not even with visible regret. She summoned her confessors, made provisions for her children, and said her farewells. She accepted last rites from priests who likely knew her name not from scandal, but from admiration. And then she slipped away, quietly, after a life that had been anything but. Ferrara mourned her deeply. The city that had once hesitated to accept her now wept openly at her death. Poets wrote elegies. The court wore black. Even her husband, Alfonso d'Este, a man who had once resisted the idea of marrying a Borgia, spoke of her with respect and affection. In death, she had achieved what seemed impossible in life: peace, dignity, and a legacy separate from her family's darkness. But outside of Ferrara, the stories didn't die. The myths surrounding Lucrezia Borgia only grew in the centuries that followed. Plays, operas, novels, all painted her as the quintessential femme fatale, the beautiful, deadly woman with a poison ring hidden inside her jewelry, the seductress who lured men to their doom, the incestuous daughter of a monstrous pope. None of these tales had strong evidence. Most had none at all. And yet, they endured. Why? Because they were more entertaining than the truth. The reality of Lucrezia Borgia, a girl born into power, manipulated from childhood, forced into marriages, surrounded by predators, stripped of control, and yet somehow still able to carve out a life of meaning, is more complex and less convenient than the caricature. It's harder to market, harder to dramatize, but it's also far more human. Modern historians have worked hard to separate fact from fiction. Most now agree that Lucrezia was not the poisoner she was made out to be. No credible evidence has ever tied her to any assassination. The infamous Canel di Lucrezia, the supposed poison hidden in a hollow ring, is a product of myth, not record. Likewise, the incest allegations remain unprovable, their only foundation being the grotesque reputation of the men around her. But what the records do show, and what makes her story so tragic, is that she was systematically used by those closest to her. Emotionally, psychologically, and perhaps even physically. From the moment she could walk, she was seen not as a child, but as a tool. Her father treated her body as currency. Her brother treated her emotions as something to be controlled. Her reputation was built on their sins, and she paid the price for them. And yet, she endured. She adapted. She learned how to negotiate, how to influence, how to rule. She survived an environment that crushed others. She found moments of happiness, created space for beauty and art, and raised children she loved. Her letters from the final years show not a villain, not a victim, but a woman searching for meaning, one who rarely spoke of her past, as if silence were the only way to contain the trauma. There's something painfully relatable in that. Lucrezia Borgia's life forces us to question how we remember history and who gets to define it. For centuries, she was portrayed as a monster because that's what sold. But peel back the legend, and what remains is a deeply human story. One of a woman born into the heart of one of history's most corrupt regimes. A woman who, against impossible odds, found a way to claim a piece of herself back. Her story isn't just about the Borgias. It's about the cost of unchecked power. About what happens when institutions meant to uphold morality become machines of exploitation. About how women, especially young women, have been used as pawns in political games, their stories rewritten to fit the needs of powerful men. It's also a reminder that even within those systems, agency can be found. That survival itself can be a form of resistance. That transformation, even after years of suffering, is still possible. Lucrezia Borgia's legacy is no longer just a cautionary tale of poison and lust. It's a story of endurance, of reinvention, of a woman who outlived the monsters who created her myth, and quietly, stubbornly, reshaped the narrative of her own life. And perhaps that's the truest revenge of all.